The letter from the IRS, addressed to my father but delivered to my penthouse apartment in Miami, a place he had never lived, was the final puzzle piece I never knew I was missing. It lay on my polished marble countertop, stark white against the dark stone, an official, incongruous presence in my meticulously ordered life. My name is Clara, and at 35, my career as a forensic financial analyst is built on finding anomalies, on spotting the single misplaced number or misdirected letter that unravels a complex web of deceit. I'd spent years untangling the finances of corporations and criminals, never once thinking to apply that same scrutiny to my own family. Me fingers, usually steady as they traced illicit money trails through complex offshore accounts, trembled slightly as I slit the envelope open. It was a simple tax notice. A CP 2000 proposing changes to a return filed for a corporation I'd never heard of, R&A Holdings, Inc. The address listed was mine. The sole officer was my father, Richard Thorne. A cold dread, chilling and familiar, began to creep up my spine. As an analyst, I knew what I was looking at. A shell corporation, a legal entity created to hold funds and obscure their origin or purpose, and it was registered to my front door. My mind raced, cross-referencing years of family conversations against this single, damning piece of paper. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment, the glittering panorama of Biscayne Bay stretching out below me. I had earned this view, clawed my way to it through sleepless nights and high-stakes projects, all while being the family's unending financial wellspring. Was this my reward, to be used as an unwitting shield for my father's secret financial architecture? My professional instincts kicked in, overriding the emotional turmoil. I booted up my encrypted work laptop and began to dig. Within minutes, I had the public incorporation documents for R&A Holdings, formed 7 years ago. No stated business purpose, no revenue. It was a ghost, a pass-through, and the A, I knew with sickening certainty, stood for Amelia, my younger sister. That evening, the warm sea breeze drifting through the open balcony doors of my parents' home in Coral Gables felt cloying, heavy with unspoken lies. The scene was a masterpiece of domestic bliss. My father, holding court at the head of the dinner table. My mother, Diane, watching him with quiet adoration. And Amelia, my perpetually aspiring artist sister, recounting her latest creative breakthrough. For years, I had played my part in this tableau, the successful, stoic older daughter, the one who picked up the checks, funded the breakthroughs, and paid for the scenery. Clara, darling, my father began, his voice smooth as the aged scotch in his glass. The insurance on the Sea Dreamer is due next week. A bit steeper this year, I'm afraid. If you could handle it. It wasn't a request, it was an expectation, delivered with the casual entitlement I'd been conditioned to accept. The Sea Dreamer was their 40-foot yacht, a symbol of the lifestyle I almost single-handedly maintained. Normally, I would have nodded, the familiar sting of resentment quickly suppressed, and transferred the $15,000, but the image of that IRS letter, of R&A Holdings tethered to my name, burned in my mind. I'm a little stretched this month. Dad, I said, my voice even, betraying none of the seismic shift happening inside me. Perhaps we could all pitch in this time. The silence was instantaneous and absolute, a sudden vacuum in the cheerful atmosphere. My father's jovial expression hardened, his fork clattering against his plate. My mother's smile froze, her hand fluttering nervously to her throat. Amelia looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion, as if I'd just started speaking a foreign language. Stretched, my father finally boomed, a vein pulsing in his temple. His face, usually ruddy with good humor, was turning a dangerous shade of crimson. What a selfish thing to say. Clara, after everything we've given you. He gestured around the lavishly decorated room, at the art on the walls I had paid for, the wine on the table I had bought. Your sister is trying to launch a new gallery project. She needs our support. You, with your fancy career and your empty apartment, what could you possibly need money for? The injustice of his words was a physical blow. A highlight reel of my sacrifices flashed through my mind, the $80. 000. I'd paid for Amelia's master's degree in Renaissance poetry. A degree she now used to write captions for her Instagram posts. The $50. 000. I'd invested in her failed pop-up gallery 2 years ago, the countless times I'd covered her rent, her car payments, her research trips to Europe, all while I was paying off my own student loans from a state school I attended, while working 2 jobs because they'd told me money was tight. My fancy career is what pays for this house's mortgage. Dad, I retorted, the words sharper than I intended. It's what paid for Amelia's education and the seed money for 3 of her failed startups. That's not fair, Amelia chimed in, her voice quivering with practiced indignation. Art takes time. It's an investment in culture. You wouldn't understand. You only think in numbers. You're right, I said, my gaze locking onto my father's. I do think in numbers. And I'm starting to think the numbers of my life, the ones involving this family, aren't adding up. As the argument escalated, a notification pinged on my father's laptop, which he'd left open on the sideboard. My analyst's eyes, trained to catch the slightest deviation, caught the preview in a fraction of a second. It was from a wealth management firm, Morgan Stanley. The subject line seared itself into my brain: Re Amelia Thorne Trust, Q4 update. A trust fund. The shell company. The constant drain on my finances. The pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a tectonic collision, the fault line running directly through my life. While I was funding their present, they had been secretly using a corporation registered to my address to funnel money into a trust fund to secure my sister's future. The favoritism I had felt my entire life. The subtle and overt ways I was treated as the family's cash machine, while Amelia was treated as its precious jewel, coalesced into a single, ugly, undeniable truth. My whole life, I'd been the investment. She'd been the inheritance. Clara, don't be ridiculous, my father was saying, his voice rising, his denial now ringing hollow and desperate. We've always treated you both equally. But his eyes darted nervously towards his laptop, a flicker of pure panic in them, and in that fleeting glance, I had all the confirmation my forensic mind would ever need. The investigation had officially begun. The drive home from Coral Gables to my apartment in Brickell was a blur of headlights and palm trees swaying like dark ghosts against the city glow. The anger from dinner had subsided, replaced by a cold, methodical clarity. The emotional part of my brain, the part that had spent a lifetime yearning for their approval, went dormant. The analyst took over. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a case. The objective to map the full extent of the financial discrepancy, quantify the damages, and uncover the operational mechanics of the deception. My family was now a subject of investigation. Back in the sterile quiet of my apartment, I poured myself a glass of water, ignoring the untouched bottle of expensive wine on the counter, a bottle I'd bought for my father last week. I opened a new, encrypted spreadsheet, the kind I used for my most sensitive corporate cases, and titled it Thorne Family Financials and Internal Audit. For the next several hours, I became an archaeologist of my own generosity, digging through 7 years of bank statements, credit card bills, and email records. Each transaction was a tiny betrayal, a piece of a mosaic I was only now seeing in its entirety. The spreadsheet grew with sickening speed. Amelia's MFA from Columbia, $82. Wu-bai. I'd paid it directly to the university, proud at the time to help my sister achieve her dream. Seed money for Amelia's art collective, $50. Ling ling ling. A loan I was told would be repaid once she sold her first piece. The collective had folded in 6 months. Down payment assistance for parents' Coral Gables home, $120. Ling ling ling. They'd sworn it was just to bridge a gap while waiting for an investment to mature. Annual maintenance and insurance for the Sea Dreamer $75. 000. Estimated at $15K divided by year for 5 years. Family vacations to Aspen. The Amalfi Coast. St. Bart's all first class $95. Ling ling ling. These were always framed as my gifts to the family. The list went on and on. Car payments. Rent for Amelia's trendy Wynwood loft. Medical bills for my mother not covered by their premium insurance. As I typed in the final number and hit sum, the result stared back at me from the screen. A digital monument to my own blindness, $547. Wubai. Over $500,000. The air left my lungs. It was an amount so vast it felt unreal. An abstraction of my life's work. Siphoned away. Transaction by transaction. Now for the shell company. For a moment, he hesitated. This was the true point of no return. Analyzing my own bank records was one thing. Actively investigating my father's private financial structures felt like a profound violation. A wave of guilt washed over me. He was my father. What if I was wrong? What if there was a reasonable explanation? The feeling was a familiar one. The ingrained response of a daughter conditioned to doubt her own judgment. But the analyst in me pushed back. Data doesn't lie. The IRS notice was a fact. The trust fund email was a fact. I pushed the guilt aside and began to trace the digital breadcrumbs. Using a series of proprietary databases and my knowledge of financial forensics, I followed the trail. It was both crude and clever. My father wasn't a master criminal, but he was a man who understood the basics of hiding money in plain sight. I found the initial deposit into RNA Holdings' corporate account, made 7 years ago, $150. Ling ling ling. It was the seed that started the trust. But where did that initial money come from? It wasn't from his salary or his known investments. I kept digging, my search terms becoming more specific, pulling old property records from the county clerk's office. And then I found it. A quitclaim deed, signed 7.5 years ago. A small, waterfront lot in Key Largo, sold for exactly $150. Ling ling ling. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that property. My maternal grandparents had left it to their granddaughters, Clara and Amelia Thorne, to share equally. I was 28 at the time, busy building my career, and my father had told me the lot was undevelopable, swampland and a tax burden, advising that we sell it for a negligible amount. He had trusted him, signing the paperwork without a second thought. He had sold my inheritance, my half, and used it as the foundational stone for a trust fund exclusively for my sister. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute. It transcended anger and settled deep in my bones as a cold, heavy certainty. He hadn't just taken my money. He had taken my history, my grandmother's legacy, and laundered it for his favorite child. I mapped the flow of funds with chilling precision. Money from the land sale went into R&A Holdings. Then, over the years, as I poured my own income into the family's lifestyle, it freed up his capital, which he then funneled through the shell company using my address as a mail drop and deposited into the Morgan Stanley trust account. I was not just the family bank. I was the unwitting accomplice in the theft of my own inheritance. The audit was complete. The evidence was irrefutable. My guilt was gone, burned away by the cold, the hard light of the truth. The spreadsheet was no longer enough. My personal audit was damning. But in my father's world of bluster and denial, it was just my word against his. To confront him, I needed something he couldn't dismiss, an independent, third-party validation. Sealed with the unimpeachable authority of a professional, I hired the best forensic accountant in Miami, a man named Mark Ellison, whose testimony had dismantled criminal enterprises. I handed him my entire life's financial history on an encrypted drive and said, "Treat me like a client. Treat my family like subjects. Find everything. A week later, I sat in his sterile, glass-walled office, the city sprawling beneath us. The report he slid across the table was a financial autopsy of my family's betrayal. It was worse than I had calculated. Mark hadn't just tallied the raw numbers, he had calculated the lost opportunity cost. He created a parallel timeline, showing where that $500,000 would be today if it had been invested in my own conservative portfolio. The final figure made me physically ill, $982. Sicher. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen nearly $1 million of my future. The shell corporation was amateurish but effective. Mark explained, his tone clinical. He used your address to avoid flagging his own, then used the steady, predictable influx of cash from you paying his expenses to mask his own capital transfers into the trust. From an accounting perspective, it's a classic case of asset misappropriation and fraudulent conveyance. From a personal perspective, he added, his voice softening slightly, it's one of the most ruthless things I've ever seen. Armed with this irrefutable proof, I began to plan the endgame. A simple confrontation would devolve into a shouting match. I needed a different venue, a different strategy. I needed a mediator, a witness, and a judge, all rolled into one. I called my uncle, David Thorne. My father's older brother was the family patriarch, a semi-retired corporate lawyer whose reputation for integrity was absolute. He was the one person my father both respected and feared. Uncle David, I said, my voice steady over the phone. I've uncovered a serious financial issue involving my father, and it directly concerns me. I need your legal advice. But more than that, I need you to preside over a family meeting in your office. I could hear the surprise in his voice, but he simply said, my conference room is available Friday at 10. I walked into that conference room on Friday feeling not like a daughter, but like a prosecutor preparing for trial. The room was intimidating. All dark wood and intimidating law books, designed to give one side an advantage. Today, that side was mine. My parents and Amelia were already there, looking uncomfortable and out of place. My father was attempting to project authority, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. My mother looked terrified, and Amelia was scrolling through her phone, feigning boredom. My uncle sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. I didn't sit. I walked to the front of the room, connected my laptop to the large presentation screen, and took a deep breath. Thank you all for coming. I began, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. I have not called this meeting to have an argument. I have called it to present the findings of a forensic financial investigation. My father started to protest, but a single, sharp look from my uncle silenced him. For the next 20 minutes, I presented my case. My voice never wavered. I was no longer the emotional daughter. I was the analyst. Exhibit A, I said, clicking to a slide showing a detailed audit of my financial contributions over 7 years, totaling $547. Woo-bay. Murmurs went around the table. Exhibit B, I continued, displaying the incorporation documents for R&A Holdings, registered to my address. My mother gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Exhibit C, I clicked again, showing the fraudulent sale of the Key Largo property my grandparents had left for me and Amelia, and a flowchart tracing the $150, 000, from that sale directly into the shell company. Finally, I put up Mark Ellison's full report. The final number, $982, 140 glowing on the screen. This is the total financial damage, including lost investment potential. A comprehensive, independently verified accounting of the money that was taken from me and funneled into a secret trust fund for my sister. I finished and turned to face them. Amelia was pale, staring at the screen as if she couldn't comprehend the numbers. My mother was openly weeping, looking at my father with shattered disbelief. My Uncle David was silent, his face a mask of cold, profound disappointment. My father, Richard, was ashen. His bravado, his bluster, his entire persona had been systematically dismantled by cold, hard data. Richard, my uncle finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. Is this true? My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and in them I saw not a tyrant, but a terrified man, stripped of all his defenses. He finally broke, slumping in his chair, his face in his hands. You don't understand, he whispered, his voice broken and hoarse. I had to. He looked up, not at me, but at his brother. You know how Clara is. She was a rocket ship from the day she was born. Top of her class. Ruthless in her career. Always landing on her feet. She was always going to be fine. His gaze shifted to Amelia, who was now staring at him in horror. But Amelia, she was just a kite. So beautiful. So full of ideas. But so fragile. She needed a tether. She needed a safety net that Clara never did. I was just trying to make sure she could fly without crashing. The room was silent. The confession hanging in the air. More damning than any financial document. He had crippled one daughter to ensure the other would never have to learn to walk on her own. My uncle slowly shook his head, his disappointment palpable. Richard, he said, his voice heavy with judgment. What you've done here. It's not protection. It's a perversion of what it means to be a father. The confession, raw and pathetic, hung in the air of the sterile conference room, sucking all the oxygen with it. My father's justification for his profound betrayal that he had crippled one daughter to coddle the other was somehow more damning than the financial evidence itself. My Uncle David, a man whose life was built on the solid bedrock of law and ethics, looked at his younger brother with an expression of such profound disappointment, it was physically painful to witness. He let the silence stretch, forcing my father to sit with the weight of his own words. Finally, David turned to my mother and Amelia. Diane. Amelia. Please wait in my outer office. I need to speak with Clara alone. His voice was quiet, but held the unbreakable authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. My mother, weeping silently, hurried out. But Amelia hesitated. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror, as if seeing for the first time the true cost of her sheltered life. Then, she too was gone. Clara, my uncle said once the heavy door clicked shut. Legally, you have him. Fraud. Embezzlement. Breach of fiduciary duty. You could pursue criminal charges. You could ruin him. He paused, his gaze searching mine. But I don't believe that's what you want. So, tell me, in a perfect world, what does justice look like to you? This was the question I had been asking myself for days. The rage I felt was a clean, purifying fire. But I knew that burning everything to the ground would leave me standing alone in the ashes. I don't want to send my father to prison, I said, my voice clear and steady. But I will not allow this system to continue for one more day. I want two things. First, complete and total financial restitution for what was stolen, including my half of the Key Largo property and the lost investment potential. Second, I want a complete restructuring of our family's financial relationship. The Bank of Clara is officially closed. My uncle nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Boundaries, not vengeance. A wise position. He called them back in. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. Amelia sat as far away from him as possible. Here is what is going to happen, David announced, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. First, the Amelia Thorne Trust will be immediately dissolved. All assets will be liquidated and appraised. An independent arbiter, appointed by my firm, We'll calculate the total amount owed to Clara, based on the findings in Mr. Second Ellison's report. That amount will be transferred to a new, irrevocable trust in Clara's name only. What remains will be placed in a separate account for Amelia, under the temporary management of a third-party trustee. He let that sink in before continuing. Second, the era of casual, unaccountable financial support is over. Clara has proposed the establishment of a formal Thorne family emergency fund. He looked directly at me. I stepped forward, taking control of my own narrative. I will contribute a fixed amount to this fund annually, I stated. It is a fraction of what I was giving before, and it is my final and only financial contribution to this family. The fund will be managed by my uncle's firm. Withdrawals can only be made for verified, catastrophic emergencies, level 3 medical crises, or essential, primary housing loss. It is not for business ventures. It is not for lifestyle maintenance. And it is not for boat insurance. It is a safety net, not a subsidy. My father looked utterly defeated, a king dethroned in his own court. But it was Amelia who surprised me. She looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked, and spoke not to her father, but to me. The Key Largo land, half of that was mine. 2. Does that mean half the money to start the trust was... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Yes, I said softly. He sold your inheritance to fund a trust in your name, then used my income to backfill his finances. He leveraged both of our futures to protect you from the present. The finality of it all settled over the room. There were no more arguments to be made. Me data had left no room for denial. Under my uncle's unwavering gaze, my parents signed the preliminary agreement, their signatures looking like scratches on the page. 3 months later, the recalibration was complete. Nearly $1 million had been transferred into my trust. The family emergency fund was established, and silence had fallen. My parents had retreated to their home. The mortgage payments now, their own responsibility. The Sea Dreamer was put up for sale. The first crack in the silence came from Amelia. It was a text message with a photo of a pay stub from a local art gallery where she was working as an assistant. The amount was pitifully small. The caption read, "It's not much, but it's mine." It was the first honest financial statement she had ever made. I texted back a single word: "Congratulations." A week later, she called me, her voice hesitant. "Hey, I have a question about setting up a 401k. The gallery offers a match, and I feel like I should, It wasn't an apology. Not in words, but in action. It was everything. She was trying to build something for herself, however small. For the first time in her life, standing on my balcony, looking out at the Miami skyline, I felt the last of the anger finally dissipate. The trust with my parents was fractured, perhaps irreparably, but the relationship was no longer a toxic, one-sided transaction. It was calibrated, based on the hard, undeniable truth I had fought to bring to light. My victory wasn't in their punishment, but in their forced evolution. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply handed them the bill for my entire life. And in doing so, I had finally bought my own freedom. The truth is, sometimes the people who are supposed to build you up become the ones holding you down. Breaking free isn't about selfishness, it's about survival. If you've ever had to fight for your own value against the people closest to you, share your story in the comments. Your journey of setting boundaries could be the light someone else needs to find their own path. Remember to like, subscribe, and share, because every story of strength deserves to be heard.